Welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, June 9th, 2024, and today we're going to be talking about a brand new CBS News national poll that shows President Trump and President Biden neck and neck on the national average and in battleground states. But the main takeaway I got from this was the shift amongst independent voters across the country when it came down to this brand new poll. Numbers that show a stark contrast from March of 2024 when Donald Trump led Joe Biden amongst independent voters by 15 percentage points. Today, Biden leads by 2. And this is largely after a guilty verdict that has consistently shown a decrease in support for President Trump across a number of key and crucial battleground states, and of course, across the national average. What we knew going into the guilty verdict was that Donald Trump would in fact be negatively impacted by any result that wasn't an innocent verdict. Ultimately, we found that now that he is guilty, he has seen detriment to his polling numbers in these battleground states. But when you take a look at the specific crosstabs, it primarily is coming from bleeding, not from Republicans, and of course, certainly not from Democrats, but amongst independent voters that are the most swayable parts of this country. Now, independent voters shifting very heavily from the month of March also has now reflected a change in national support for President Biden and President Trump. Still, Joe Biden is losing to Donald Trump by 1 percentage point across the country, but when you actually take a look at their battleground sample across battleground states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Wisconsin, etc., Joe Biden actually leads Donald Trump by 1 point. And now this might be in complete contrast with what we know about elections, that the popular vote is going to be far more Democratic than the battleground states. But what the 2022 midterms showed us was that despite Republicans winning the generic congressional vote, winning the national popular vote in essence by 3 percentage points, Democrats still won in their important battleground states. States like Pennsylvania and Georgia and Arizona and Nevada went to the Democratic Party. Also on the gubernatorial level, we saw in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona all go to Democrats, again, despite Republicans winning the popular vote. And so there has been this sort of uncertainty about what the national vote might actually mean for these battleground states. Is it genuinely possible that President Biden leads in these battleground states despite losing nationally? The answer is absolutely. And of course, these midterms aren't the only example of that. President Biden did see some overperformances in 2020 when it came down to what we saw on the national average. For instance, when we look at states like Colorado, New Mexico, Virginia, Minnesota voted well outside what the margin was when it came down to the national average. In 2012, when President Obama won re-election, however, he won Virginia by less. And so some states you started to see have trended a little bit more to the Democratic Party, meaning that while the rest of the nation and the bleeding that we see from President Biden in states like New York and California, which are very populous and do have detrimental effects down ballot for House races and Senate races, the bleeding on the national average does not seem to be coming explicitly from swing states like we've seen in years past and elections past. And that's an important distinction to keep in mind when we're looking at this national number. And so when you take a look at the independent voters too, this is a 17-point shift in just 3 months. A 17-point shift that arguably could be the reason why Joe Biden wins the presidential election. A 17-point shift that is the reason he leads in these battleground states. And so when you take a look at these electoral map ratings here, my most recent ones and also the ones you see from Cook Political Report, Inside Elections, the reason that despite Trump's leads and the best performing polls that we've seen for the former president, since arguably ever, means that, in some instance, we would be saying that it's a Republican wave. There's no reality in which Trump loses, but there absolutely is. And that's because of things like this guilty verdict that have made it very difficult for Donald Trump to win over independent voters in a way that he was prior to the guilty verdict, something that the Biden campaign is hammering in and arguably may not last as long as we might think, right? The conviction is in fact hurting Donald Trump. That is fact. But it is also early. This is something that could be changed by an outcome of a Trump victory at the first presidential debate. This is something that could be changed by the outcome of Donald Trump doing more things and Hunter Biden getting involved with the Biden family. All of these different factors that you really compound into a reason why people vote the way they vote. Maybe the conviction won't be as important to voters in 4 months from now as it is important today. And I think while that may be a fair assumption, there's a whole idea of momentum. Donald Trump has had continuous momentum for the past 6 months up until the conviction. And now we're starting to see a halt in the polling lead that he has in some of these states. The polling leads overall, just at his advantage. The only real benefit we've seen for Donald Trump amongst his conviction is that his base is inspired. Equally, the Democratic base is also inspired to vote against him. We'll talk about that in the CBS News poll in just a moment. But also fundraising. Donald Trump has raised $150 million. Talking about since the conviction, you are raising tens of millions of dollars on the conviction alone. The day the conviction dropped in 24 hours, Donald Trump raised $53 million. And so financially speaking, there has been a benefit. But when it comes down to public perception, the way that independent voters vote, Donald Trump has lost support. I want us to also take a look at some of the more important numbers that they pull out. Again, the battleground states show better results for President Biden. That's also a conversation for another video, and also just generally a conversation for things when we talk about election odds and who's ahead in these battleground states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. But when you talk about convictions and exactly why this matters to voters here, you see that a Trump conviction in their vote, amongst likely voters, 28% consider this to be a major factor. And so the idea that no American actually cares about this is entirely, not rooted in reality. 17% say that this is a minor factor, and 55% say it's not a factor. And I think that is largely Donald Trump supporters and solidified Joe Biden supporters who say that this is not at all going to sway the way that I vote. And reasonably speaking, you didn't see that much shift on the national. Donald Trump used to lead in the CBS News poll back in March by 3 points. Today, he leads by 1. And so an overall 2-point shift is largely consistent with what we've seen across a number of states and also, of course, on the national average. Now, when compared to other issues, though, the Trump conviction comes in the least important amongst voters, but still is up there. It's ranked amongst groups like the economy and inflation and state of democracy, which arguably have way, way, way more consideration amongst voters who are thinking of this as something that they care about when it comes down to who they're voting for and why they're voting, but it still is a factor. It's still that one piece of people's minds, same thing with abortion, that while may not be the most prevalent, might not even be the top 10 when it comes down to voters, but is still a factor that could be the nudging reason why Joe Biden and the Democratic Party wins, because it's exactly how it was in 2022. Abortion very often didn't rank that high. It wasn't more important than inflation or the economy or democracy or crime or the southern border. You often found it was in the top 10, but not in the top 5. And yet, it was a resounding victory for Democrats in battleground states, in governor races, House races, Senate races, and a large reason was because of this increased turnout in relation to the Dobbs decision, and also just generally speaking, because voters cared about abortion. They cared about all of these things, but they always care about all of these things. And when you add in a new factor that is unique to an election, like the Dobbs decision was for 2022, like this conviction is for 2024, again, if they were already predetermined to be undecided on all these issues that arguably Republicans are polling better on, this could be the reason that they decide to vote blue. And so what I also think, too, shows me exactly why we're starting to see Biden's numbers shore up in terms of this conviction is when you ask voters, what is your main reason for supporting Biden? It's the same thing that we saw in 2020, where the opposition to Trump was the leading and driving factor for how Donald Trump was losing the election. Why he was losing was that it was direct opposition to him rather than support for President Biden. And back in March, 31% of likely Biden voters said, I like Biden. I'm backing him because I support him. And again, this was a smaller portion of the overall electorate because Biden was polling less, right? This means that this is probably more of his core constituency, and so the number is going to be higher. That has seen a decrease. Now, what has seen a noticeable increase is that the opposition to Trump is 7 points higher than it was back in March. 54%, now meaning the majority, that was not the case before, the majority of Biden voters support him just to oppose Donald Trump. And this is actually the direction that the Biden campaign largely needs to get on, needs to make this a two-way race. When you also take a look, too, at how people are voting, when you see a choice for president, the majority of voters see this as an issue of comparing Biden and Trump, not necessarily about something related to policy, not necessarily about something related to their own personal lives. A lot of this is just Donald Trump, Joe Biden, who do I see as marginally better? Now, when you also take a look, too, when we're talking about judgment of Biden and judgment of Trump, a lot of the times, the voters that are voting for the candidate often are looking at the other candidate in a negative light. And that is the reason they're voting for their candidate here. And so I think it's very interesting that you do find this to be the driving factor and the driving reason for the election. But this is how Joe Biden wins. It's how he won in 2020, and it's how he can win again in 2024. Now, when I take a look at some of these crosstabs too, I think what we also find is that Joe Biden has actually experienced some bleeding that we've talked about. Exit polls from 2020 show that amongst younger voters, Joe Biden took a larger lead, 24 points, amongst a very similar demographic group now that is saying they back Joe Biden by just 20 points. And that bleeding here, I think, can largely be summed up by Joe Biden's response to international conflict, namely what's happening in Israel and Palestine, and things that we do see as driving factors away from the Democratic Party in regions like Dearborn, Michigan, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, areas of the country that Joe Biden needs to have huge vote dumps in order to win in largely what is extremely important battleground states. And so when you see this bleeding, I think it explains also largely why he has this decrease in lead nationally, but still a lead in swing states. That it is still very much possible that he loses the popular vote, but somehow wins the Electoral College. And while that stands to be against reason of what we've known about the past 5 elections in the 21st century, it actually is one of the more likely outcomes of this election because this is such a strange election. This is the 3rd time that Donald Trump is on the ballot, the 2nd time that we are seeing a Biden versus Trump rematch. We rarely ever see rematches, at least to this level, where either candidate could genuinely win. It is very, very, very rare that losing presidents come back to win re-election. In fact, it has only happened once in American history. You often bow out and decide that that was it. I'm done. My party would never renominate me. Obviously, that wasn't the case with Donald Trump. But obviously, too, there are way more factors at play here because, largely, his base does not believe he lost the 2020 election. Now, we're getting off a bit on a tangent here, and so I want to go back to take a look at this 2024 presidential vote intention. It includes leaners, which is why the numbers are so high. Very much different than what we see in some of these other states and some of these other national polls where you see Donald Trump and Joe Biden at 46, 44, 45, 43, different because these voters are being essentially boxed in to make a decision. And so when you take a look, too, the bleeding that we see doesn't always come from those who identify as liberal or moderate or conservative. I will say, too, I do not believe the metrics that say that Joe Biden is winning Hispanic voters by just 1 point. You do see that polls that are done, national polls that are done just primarily amongst Hispanic voters, Joe Biden still maintains about a 20-point lead. I'm actually making a video on that later today. And so when you talk about this and you see crosstabs that, show us this, I also start to question. Sometimes these samples don't get everything correct. The portions of this group, when they're trying to do a representative sample, and let's say you're talking a total size here of 1,300. When you have 13% of the American public that is black, 13% of respondents in this poll are likely also to be black. When you take a look at race breakdown, Hispanic voters, groups of other demographic groups, you often find that because they're so small in terms of overall sample compared to nationalized polls that are done just for the demographic group, you don't exactly get perfect numbers. And so again, you don't also get perfect respondents and perfect representation of said respondents. And so that could also be a contributing factor to the national average where you see some of these crosstabs here that tell us that yes, the bleeding exists, and it probably does, because the people that they chose are in a way representative. But when you take a look at larger national samples, when you take a look at polls that are done primarily amongst youth, primarily amongst X demographic group, the bleeding isn't as strong, which is again why a lot of these major political firms here seem to suggest that Joe Biden still has a very, very strong chance at winning the presidency. Because it's exactly what we think. We look at some of these numbers and say, wow, this means Biden is doomed. In reality, he's not. Independent voters, though, I do think, because they make up a more considerable portion than just one smaller demographic group. Same thing with white voters. You generally are getting a representative sample because there are enough. You're talking nearly 1,000 respondents here are, white voters across the country. With independent voters, you're talking roughly a third of poll respondents here. This is a good sample because you also see that this is the same sample that we've seen generally over the past couple of months. This is the same type of demographic. This is the same type of grouping here. And so what you do find is that when independent voters are swinging 17 points to the left, it's something you cannot ignore. Because again, it also is a large enough sample that shows that, hey, even too on the terms of moderate voters who identify as a moderate here, 57 to 42, obviously larger than independent. Not every moderate identifies as an independent in the American election system. That's also because of closed party systems. And so this is not a perfect metric. But when it comes down to party ID and also ideology, Joe Biden does take it away when it comes down to those who identify as moderate. Even amongst conservative voters here, you find that 11% back Biden. Just 6% of those who identify as liberal back Trump. And so I think, generally speaking, President Biden, post-conviction for Donald Trump, has been doing significantly better. And while that may only be reflected in just a 2-point shift nationally, it certainly is going to make a major impact when it comes down to these battleground states. I don't think I have to remind any of us about the long and grueling 2020 election process, where we waited 4 days to get calls on a number of battleground states like Georgia and Michigan and Nevada. Nevada took a very long time, if you remember, to count their ballots back then. And so I think when it comes down to the margins, when it comes down to a Biden victory in a state like Wisconsin in 2020, where he won by 0.6, or in Arizona by 0.2, or in Georgia by 0.3, or, flip those actually, got it wrong. Georgia 0.2, Arizona 0.3. Point being, these states often come down to the narrowest of margins. And so every single negative factor for Donald Trump lost him that election. You could pinpoint anything and say, this is the reason Donald Trump lost the race. And in a way, you would be correct. But it was the fact that Democrats were able to make this a compounding thing for voters. Not only was it the COVID response, it was also what we saw from 2017 through 2019. Democrats hammered this in. and you know what pushed them over the top, voters here, was COVID. We saw that since the pandemic had started and the public blamed Donald Trump for a lot of what had happened nationally, he saw a drastic decrease in support. Biden might have been leading him nationally pre-COVID, 3 to 4 points, but what we saw was that he needed the bump based on what the actual results were. Now, while I don't see the election in the same light, I do believe that a conviction, when voters have taken into account the economy, inflation, the southern border, and Donald Trump's lead is just 3 points, and the conviction narrows him down to 1 and makes him from being in the lead amongst battleground states to losing. I do think this is an important factor, and I think it's one that could define this election and could define Donald Trump's losses in a number of these battleground states. It may not be the only reason should Donald Trump lose the election, but it will be a big part of it. And these new numbers from CBS and specifically amongst independent voters suggest exactly what we've known and what we've been seeing over the past couple of days. And so I'm interested to see, again, ABC News is right in saying that this conviction is early. Could this change in 2 months from now? The answer is probably, right? But it will be interesting to track over time about how much this conviction makes a difference. Is it just a post-conviction bump for President Biden, or is it something that will remain consistent? We're sure he might be losing on the national average, but still expected to win a couple of battleground states, and maybe just enough to push him over the finish line for 4 more years of a Biden administration. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist from my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.